Welcome to all the participants. I must just talk about what this TEF is that, Professor Pravat's email carries TEF09. TEF is Teaching Excellence Forum. I think Teaching Excellence Forum, why I'm talking about it in the ninth session of the Teaching Excellence Forum that we're doing in this particular year, because Teaching Excellence Forum was conceived as a body that's right in the spirit of open pedagogy. So 5 years back, what we realized is a lot of faculty will experiment, try new things, and these new things would be largely we're looking at from a pedagogical standpoint, ways of managing a classroom, ways of enhancing student learning. From a business school context, how do I get students more engaged in case teaching? How do I use a simulation? How do I make sure that students come more well prepared? What is the objective of assessment? Variety of different things that teachers are all the time thinking about. And you know what? All good teachers keep on innovating, trying out new things, failing at many of them, learning from those, modifying. And therefore, when you have, we realized that let's in the coffee lounge, when we would have a chat with faculty, and you had somebody or the other would have just come out of a class and would be thrilled about it, or somebody else would feel that, I could have made my class a lot better. How do I tackle something like this? And we realized that a lot of answers were available with fellow teachers. So we decided, why don't we have something called as a Teaching Excellence Forum, which we first start off as an internal body, and we have a lot of people from outside who can participate. So what we would do is pick up a topic. Let's say a topic could be, how do you make a classroom more engaging? And for that topic, you would have one or two faculty colleagues who would lead the discussion, and everybody else would then bring their experience to the table. So everyone would learn as a part of that. And of course, it was not limited to what happened at GIM. You would have a lot of external resource persons, external participants who would come in, and some would be facilitators, and a lot of others. Everybody on this Teaching Excellence Forum would contribute whatever their experience has been in terms of the failures they've had, the experiments they've tried, the successes they've had, and that's something that's I think helped us to be able to significantly change, try out and experiment with different kind of pedagogical styles. Of course, this is only one small part of open pedagogy. There is so much more, right from teaching materials to content to variety of things like that. And I was so glad when Pravat said that we're going to have a talk specifically, looking at this topic. I think it's probably the first time for me. It's the first time I'm sitting on a session that's centered around open pedagogy, and I'm so excited to listen to this, to contribute to this, as I'm sure all the other participants are, who are willing at 7:30 in the evening after a tough day, managing both office as well as work from home for many of you, and your homes, being here. I realize one of the major reasons you're here is because of the topic per se. So thank you so much, Professor Arley, and thank you all the participants on this. I'm sure we're going to have a really open session on open pedagogy. With that, over to you, Professor Arley and Pravat.
Professor Arley, it's over to you.
So let's get started. I'm very excited to be speaking with you here today. My name is Arley Cruthers. I teach applied communications at Kwantlen Polytechnic. But first of all, I want to start off with a thank you, because I think that whenever we have a chance to have a discussion with a new group, it's always important to start with gratitude. So thank you, first of all, for the invitation, for the lovely introduction. And thank you to all of you for making time to be here. So, in the middle of a global pandemic, I know it's late where you are, it's early where I am. It's wonderful that we could come together today. And also because this is open pedagogy, this presentation actually uses open pedagogy. So Dr. Raju Jangiani and Andrea Niosi created some of the slides and put an open license on them so that I can use them today. So I'll talk just a little bit about, the introduction sort of gave a bit of an idea of who I am. I've had a lot of different jobs in my life, And one of the things that allows me to bring to teaching is just an appreciation for how much I've learned when things have been hands-on. So when I have had the chance to, I've been an athlete, and if you've ever played a sport, you probably have had the feeling of just practicing something in a gym by yourself is a lot different than practicing it in the middle of a game. So I'll be talking a little bit about that background. But let's get started right away. So we're going to start with a short reflection about what we want to get out of this session. I'm going to be talking, the presentation will be in 3 parts. So in the first part, I'll talk about what I mean by open. So when I say open, what do I mean by that? In the second part, I'll talk about what is open pedagogy and why might you want to do that. And then in the last part, I'll give you some examples of my own work, from other people's work, and how I've used open pedagogy during COVID-19. This should only take about 15 minutes, so hopefully we'll have a lot of time for questions still at the end. And I'm happy to stay later because of some of the audio glitches. So before we begin, one thing to know is that you might actually be already doing open pedagogy without learning that name. So hopefully this session, if you are doing something with open pedagogy, can give you a sense of community. But the other part is that this is our session, so if it's not working, raise your hand, speak up if you have questions, and we can hopefully learn from one another because there's a ton of teaching knowledge in this room that we can draw on. So first of all, to make sure that this session is relevant, as well as to practice open pedagogy, I'd like to do a quick group brainstorm, and in the chat, I'd like to write the answers to the following questions. So let's start with question number 1. We'll get people to answer, and then we'll move on to question 2. So question 1 is, what do you hope to learn from this session? So you can just put the answers in the chat about what you hope to learn from this session. Yeah, so I think those are some great, ethics, an introduction. So second question is, what worries, or maybe we'll combine these last 2 questions into one. So what worries or concerns do you have about open pedagogy? And have you ever done open pedagogy? And if so, what did you do? So do you have any worries or concerns? And have you ever done open pedagogy? And if so, what did you do? So let's talk, you can keep typing your responses. I'll make sure to go back to them during the questions. But I thought I would start with a discussion between the difference between what is something that's open and what's something that's free. Because I know that when I started, this is something that was a lot of confusion for me. So when something is free, that simply means that the resource is available online and it doesn't cost anything. So for example, I might choose to share with my students a newspaper article or a website. I don't own the copyright to that. I don't have the license, but it's freely available online. I can share it. I just can't do anything with it. An open license, however, means that the person who created that content has put what's called a Creative Commons license on there, and that has given you, the user, permissions to do a whole bunch of different things with that content. And so this makes open license content really gives us a lot of a wide range of things that we can do. And there's what's called the 5 R's of open educational resources. So if something is open, we can reuse it. So I can take it, let's say that I find a chapter of an open textbook that I want to use. I can take it, I can download it, I can upload it to my course site, I can put it into a press book so that it becomes my own textbook. So I can, at the very least, I can reuse content. I can also revise content, and this is where open gets really exciting. So say I teach applied communications. I sometimes will find sources that are American, and I want to change some of the examples, change the spelling so that they reflect my Canadian context. So I can do that. I can revise this work. So I can change it, I can adapt it. I can also remix it. So I can take different open sources and combine them. I might take parts of one and add it to parts of the other. So this is great because I can really make a resource what I want. So maybe some of you have had the experience with a textbook where, you have a chapter and you really only want the students to maybe read page 1 to 5 and then maybe page 20 to 30. You can just take out that middle chunk, or you can add something else in there. You also retain content. So you can, I often have students who use online textbooks that are for pay that cost money. So where the code expires after the end of the semester. So with Open, you retain those resources. You can keep this Open textbook around. You can refer back to it later. And then the last is redistribute. So I can share it. I can pass it on to a fellow colleague. So the great thing about this Open movement, is that it gives instructors a lot of flexibility. And Open exists beyond textbooks. So we also have assignments, modules, PowerPoints. There's a lot of different materials that people put Creative Commons licenses. There's also Creative Commons licenses on videos and photos. So if you want to find things to add to make your PowerPoints really colorful, there's a lot of different options. So the main thing that we're talking about here is just that when I'm talking about open educational resources, I'm talking about resources that the creator has put a license on it that allows you to use it, remix it, adapt it. So do we have any questions at this point about what I mean when I say open?
Professor Arley, would you like me to read out some of the questions from the chat? One of the questions that has come is how to make online classroom or sessions more engaging and interesting for the students. So yeah.
Yes, so I think that's a great question. That question of how do we make our students engaged and interested? And I think when we talk a little bit about what open pedagogy is, the goal of open pedagogy is to sort of give students power in the classroom. And often when students have the feeling of power or control, they're often more engaged in the subject material, especially if they have choice. So I'll be showing you a few examples of some ways that you can use open pedagogy to really engage students and get them interested. So getting them to sort of do rather than kind of absorb the content. So that's a great question to start us off here.
So, and there is another question, 2 more questions I'll pick up. Another is more like a query, what are the challenges of implementation of open pedagogy, especially for a large classroom? So that's another question.
So the idea of a large class is, the goal of open pedagogy, some of the other things that I'll be talking about in the presentation are ways to start small. So large classes, obviously you can't be grading if students are, say, blogging, you can't have them grade, you can't be grading, 500 blog posts. But there's a lot of ways to practice open pedagogy where either students are working with each other. So you don't necessarily have to be grading all of the open pedagogy things that your students are doing. So, maybe you grade something at the end. So there's ways that we can use open pedagogy as a study tool and as a way for students to practice with each other. And we can also do some small movements. So in large classes, we can maybe try to, part of open pedagogy is designing policies with students. So in a large class, you might begin the semester picking maybe just one policy that you want student input on. And, you can use breakout rooms and other things to facilitate that discussion. But open pedagogy doesn't have to be a huge redesign of your course. It can just be a small thing that you have done, just a small tweak, giving students input on one particular aspect of the course, just as a way to see how open pedagogy works for you.
True. And the last question, which we may not have to take it right away. There is one more question. I'm leaving it with you. Maybe at a later part, you can address it. So this one kind of raises a question. Is open pedagogy compliance with accreditation bodies like, let's say, ACSB, etc.? So are they go along with it, or are there some issues to get open pedagogy when it comes to accreditations?
Yeah, so one barrier is that if you teach a course that has specific things that you have to do for your accreditation body, or sometimes just within your department, and maybe if everyone is teaching the same set of assignments, etc. It can be a bit tricky to do full open pedagogy projects. However, I'll talk about later in the presentation some small moves that we can make to practice open pedagogy, the same as some of the examples that I gave with large classes. So, we don't have to totally redo everything that we're doing. We can make a small moment. So we can use open pedagogy as a study tool. We can use it as a coming up with some classroom policies. We can do it sometimes as an optional assignment or as an alternative. So one of the things I'll talk about later in the presentation is that we're always practicing within a set of constraints. And so often it's about looking for sort of small moments that we can try some of these tools. So let's move on to this in the next bit. So the first bit is about sort of what is open pedagogy, or what is open. But let's narrow our focus into open pedagogy. So this photo depicts, this is I think from the year 1908, and this is someone in France who was imagining what a school would look like in the year 2000. And as you can see, it's past the year 2000. We obviously don't have magic brain zapping technology, but it's really interesting to see how this author imagined school. So literally the professor is feeding the books into this machine, and it's being powered right into the heads of the students. And you'll notice that these students are all male, they're all white. There's a lot of assumptions being made here. But this is the perfect illustration of what's called the banking concept of education. So in 1970, Paulo Freire wrote that the banking model of education turns students into containers to be filled by the teacher. The more completely she fills the receptacles, the better the teacher she is. The more meekly the receptacles permit themselves to be filled, the better students they are. Education thus becomes the act of depositing, in which students are the depositories and teachers are the depositors. In the banking concept of education, knowledge is a gift bestowed from those who consider themselves knowledgeable onto those who they consider to know nothing. So this is a model of education that I know it's one that I encountered when I was in school. The idea that the teacher is simply filling the student up with knowledge. And so often traditional education sort of views students as kind of empty vessels. But the goal of pedagogy is to kind of sort of focus on the student, respect and celebrate what the student brings to the learning environment. And so seeing students as partners in education, rather than this is me giving you knowledge. And the reason that this can be an effective approach is that it's a much more active way to engage students. So if students see that you're respecting their knowledge and abilities and drawing on their abilities, often they become a lot really excited about learning. So open education is about access to knowledge, right? We're giving you these free resources that professors can edit and change the way they want. But open pedagogy is about knowledge creation. So rather than students sitting back and consuming knowledge, students are creating knowledge. So they're contributing to public knowledge commons. So let's take a quick look at a definition of open pedagogy. And I'll read it out here, and I'll just pick out a few points. This is a definition that comes from my own institution's definition of open pedagogy. Open pedagogy is an access-oriented commitment to learner-driven education. It's a process of designing architectures and using tools for learning that enable students to shape the public knowledge commons of which they are a part. Open pedagogy in practice can include creating, adapting, or updating OER with students, building course policies, outcomes, assignments, rubrics, and schedules of work collaboratively with students, or facilitating student-created and student-controlled learning environments, such as domains of one's own. So there's a couple of things that I'll highlight here. So first, this idea of learner-driven education. Learners are able to actually build their classroom environment. So this can mean learners creating assignments, learners creating rubrics to assess assignments. So maybe you might pick one assignment that you already teach and have the students identify what does success look like in this assignment? What should the teacher be grading? You might have students build course policies, but a lot of open pedagogy involves having students communicate their knowledge publicly. So maybe keeping a blog or a website, creating OER, so actually contributing to a textbook. So rather than students just reading the textbook, they might be writing parts of the textbook. So they're shaping the public knowledge commons. And the goal here is to move away from what we call disposable assignments. So these are the sort of assignments where a student does once, they put in a drawer and forget about it. So with open pedagogy, because there's an authentic audience, so there's an audience usually outside of the classroom, often what students produce is has a life longer than the classroom. So if a student creates a blog, they might choose to keep that blog running. I'll talk later about a report that my students did where they made this report. They worked together to write a report about how our university could better support international students. That was read by the president of the university. It's been used to develop policy in Ontario, in different universities across Canada, in different universities in the US. So the learning, the knowledge gets passed on longer than the duration of a class. So the benefit of open pedagogy and renewable assignments is, first of all, collaboration. So it's always exciting when you can learn something from a student. For example, I did a blogging project last semester, and I blogged quite a bit, but it turned out that I had a student who was a fashion blogger, and he made his living doing fashion blogging. So we were able to draw on his knowledge and really enrich the experience for the other students. Open pedagogy is active and engaging, so students are really able to do hands-on work, kind of creating this knowledge. They can take pride in their work, so the knowledge that somebody else is probably going to be seeing this, not just the teacher, often makes students feel pride in their work, so they're putting in a lot more effort towards it. It also often gives students a choice of how to express their work, and this is one thing that's really exciting for me, is that when I started teaching, I would grade the same batch of 50 papers. Nearly all of them were the same. With open pedagogy, I'm grading a range of things. So, it's a lot more fun and interesting for me to grade as well. It's also often a lot more relevant and updated. So I have a colleague who does marketing, and she has her students create pieces for her open textbook. And that allows the marketing content to remain really fresh. So she doesn't have to go through and do all that work herself. Her students are learning about this topic and then communicating it. So one big message here is, again, we've talked already about the fact that some of us have to are held to accrediting bodies. Some of us have very large classes. The goal here is not to totally change everything. You can start really small. So you can have students write maybe a short article, and maybe you collect those articles and turn them into an open textbook or a study guide. You might work with students to design a rubric or grading scheme for one particular assignment, maybe just a small assignment worth 5%, and just see how it goes. You might have students come up with the questions for a test. So if you're helping them study for a large exam, maybe the one study method is having them actually generate the questions. And then maybe you pick a few to include on the exam. You might work on an assignment with a class, or you might just choose to have students choose between a traditional assignment and an open pedagogy assignment. So give them the option. So we don't have to totally change things. The goal about open pedagogy is that you can really just start small and try one little thing and see if it works. So let's talk about a few barriers here. We've already talked about standardized curriculum, and so the solution there is to, again, make small changes where you can. So this could be having open pedagogy to be mostly in-class activities. So, maybe you have students come up with questions to ask to an expert on Twitter, for example. Another barrier is that students often don't want to show their work publicly, and that's okay. We can simply give students the choice about whether to show their work. And often students are really worried or nervous because this is a new approach for them. And one of the solutions to that is to simply build trust slowly and explain why you're using these approaches. Often people worry about the lack of time. We're in the middle of a pandemic. You know, none of us has any time, you know, to spare, especially those of us with children. But the nice thing about open licenses is that you don't have to do it all yourself. So you can use an openly licensed assignment that somebody else has created and just try that, use it in your class and maybe tweak it or adapt it. And I'll be linking to something called the Open Pedagogy Notebook that is a collection of open pedagogy assignments that other instructors have created. So you don't have to do it all yourself. You can also structure, because students are sort of driving the content, the nice thing about this approach is that you also don't have to be involved in everything. So one of the things that is amazing to me about my class sometimes is when I read students' year-end reflections, I see that a lot of learning has happened away from me, right? Students have worked with each other. Students have gone out and contacted an expert, which is awesome. There's also, sometimes people think about open pedagogy as just technology, using technology, but it doesn't have to be. I survey students in advance and figure out what their technology needs are. So for example, I teach a lot of international students from India. And so one of the barriers that we have had is time zone differences. So we've had to, when creating open pedagogy assignments, we've had to be really creative about time zone differences. Maybe some students have inconsistent internet access. So if you survey students in advance, then you know that and you can make the, you can adapt. And then the last part is that often, you know, when I say have students design course policies, that can feel really nerve-wracking. You know, what if students just say, okay, we want everybody to get an A in the class? But the nice thing, giving up control can be really hard, but it can also be really rewarding. And so again, the solution there is to just start small, you know, try one assignment or one course policy and see how it goes. So I'll stop there for other questions. So does anyone have any other questions about open pedagogy? You can type them in the chat or
yeah, there was one more question. I think how do we store this repository of knowledge? I mean, if this is open pedagogy, so partially I think you have addressed in this slide, but it had come little earlier. So I think you might again read, I mean, if you would like to touch upon it again. So there was this query where it was asked like this open pedagogy, through open pedagogy, the material that is created, how is it getting stored, or are there any suggestion from your end?
Yeah, so when we're talking about open OERs, open educational resources, we can either, often we don't have to store them. So if you're just using an open textbook, it can be hosted by somebody else. You can store some of these on your learning management system, and there's also different repositories. I use, for example, Pressbooks, but my institution has a subscription to that. So there's a lot of ways that we can store this content. In terms of how to, so students are creating things, open pedagogy pieces that we want to share with the world. There's a lot of different ways that we can do that. So students can create blogs. Often there's a lot of free blogs that you can sign up for. We use WordPress quite a bit. Students can send material to you, and you can choose to for example, put it on social media. I've also done collaborative writing using Google Docs and Microsoft OneDrive. So there's different platforms out there that you can use that will allow you to share your students' work with a greater common. So you can either do that using social media, which is really common. The other option that you can do is do your open pedagogy within your learning management system, and then give students a choice of how they want to share. So maybe the students want to share on their own social media. Maybe you want to take their material and turn it into an open textbook and post it on something like Pressbooks. So there's a lot of different options.
Yeah, I think just listening to you, I think I realized something which I've been doing for last 4 or 5 years without really being aware that it is part of probably open pedagogy. And I'm sure many of our participants might be doing something similar. So let me share, and then others can please type in if you're doing something similar. So it is like one of my elective courses. There is this project component, which is actually a video. So students have to go out there, create a video report. and the video report is actually have to be uploaded onto YouTube. Now it is on the social media, so the repository cost, etc., is not there. I mean, we are taking care of. Of course, as you rightly said, in one of the barriers, sometimes some students tend to have this issue about sharing. So I do give them an option that you have to share it with me through YouTube, but YouTube has got these three options: private, unlisted, and publicly listed. So I said you have to make it unlisted if you are not very sure. But in spite of giving that opportunity, I'm sure each year out of 12 odd groups that do various of these projects, except for one or two groups, almost all the groups make it publicly available. And the projects that are probably 3 years old or maybe 2 years old have already got more than 2,000, 2,500. At least one of them have got 8,000 views so far. So that's a kind of a initially when I introduced this concept, it was a very tedious task. It was difficult to get buy-in from the student. But later, yes, what I do is I just show those links. I guide them. I say, see, this is what you can possibly get, and then my job is much easier. So point is, it is up to you in your course. So mine is a rural marketing course to give the others a little bit head in. And many of our students happens to be from, let's say, urban pockets. So you send them to a rural market, and then there is a guideline given what is that they have to observe and what is the kind of story I'm expecting. Thereafter, I leave it to them, but the story has to be a video format only, and which gets uploaded into YouTube. So I guess this component, so while many of the other components of my pedagogy continues to be not open, but at least this project component is an example of, I guess, open pedagogy, and the repository is YouTube.
Yes, and thank you for sharing that. That's a great example of open pedagogy. So you can just imagine, how empowering it is for students who see that they got 8,000 views on their video. And that's also something that's going to look great on a resume or a CV, being able to say, if I'm going to go get a job in marketing, saying, even as a student, I'm creating content that's getting such a big following. So I know how to do these tools. So it's something that for many students, open pedagogy projects can lead to job opportunities, for example. So yeah, that's a wonderful example of open pedagogy. So thank you for sharing that. Do we have any other
right now there is not much questions. Yeah.
Awesome. So I'll just very quickly go through a few examples, and then we'll have time to get into some of the other questions that we generated before the session. So I'll just spend a minute or two just showing you some examples. Sometimes it's nice to see if you fit like physical examples here. So this is a bigger open pedagogy project that I did. My 3 classes, so if we're talking about big groups, this was a group of 75 students who all came together to write one single research project. And when I think about open pedagogy, I try to think about how to solve problems in my class. So rather than doing open pedagogy just for the sake of it, just because I feel like I have to, I have used open pedagogy to solve a problem that I have. So the problem that I had was that I had a research paper that students were doing. It was only, 8 pages. So not long enough to solve a really interesting problem. And so for that reason, I ended up getting some problems with plagiarism. So the solution was that students all came together. They wrote a giant report. They did their own research. And this is the one that I gave you the example. This is an illustration of it from a student who created a cover image for our report, talking about some of the mental health challenges that international students face. But the thing that was very cool for students is that when we put this report out online, being able to see experts in the field, people who are thought leaders in education, responding to them, it really made them feel like their voice was heard. But that's a big example, and the whole course was structured around that project. But this is just a little example. So I teach both an introductory communication course and then an advanced course. And one of the problems that I was having was in the advanced course, sometimes some students took it last semester, some students took it 5 years ago. And so, and different instructors teach it different ways. So we needed to do some review. So for this assignment, they were challenged to go back to the introductory textbook and pick one concept that they wanted to review. And then create one piece of content that would teach that topic to a first-year student. And if I liked it, I would put it in my textbook because I have an open textbook. And so this is an interactive piece of content that someone displayed, and usually, when you click on these, a little pop-up will tell you parts about the argument. And this is a student who reimagined this communication model called CMAP, and came up with this fun little way to remember it. So this is not something that I would have thought about. I've taught this topic for for many, many years, but the student had a new perspective. And so this is great. They are able to review the work that they did. So they can review their past work and make sure that everyone is starting with the same knowledge. And then they also have an authentic audience. So they know that if they do their work well, that they could get included in a textbook. And so that's a publication credit that they can have, they could put on their resume. And it helped me out because it made my book a lot richer. I am, I'm not just to say my age, but I am not 20 years old anymore. Often 20-year-olds can teach content, have a unique perspective to other 20-year-olds rather than what I think is important. So this was just a small assignment. It was just worth 5%. But as you can see, students put a lot of work into it because they really wanted to get included in this textbook. So just to quickly talk about how some of the ways that open pedagogy can help during COVID-19. One of the great things about using open educational resources is that I have a lot of colleagues whose textbook supply chains have really been disrupted. So they're having a hard time getting students textbooks. But open educational resources are free, they're often digital, they're easy to share. Because open pedagogy draws on students' own experiences, it's very, very difficult to plagiarize. So it really encourages academic honesty and eliminates the need for some schools are investing in proctoring software and stuff. It really, because it's testing higher level concerns, so it often reduces the need for proctoring software. It can also reduce student stress. So if students are really interested in the topic and they're able to, they can see that this, what they're doing could help them in their job and in their career, often it reduces their stress because they're not just feeling like it's busy work, or they're able to pursue an interest that they have. And open pedagogy can also help you build connections with your students, even if you're far apart. And I'll show you an example of that. So when COVID hit, the final project for one of my classes was impossible. So we decided to instead create archives of our life during coronavirus for future historians. So students made videos, students made blogs. I blogged along with students. And many students said that that was very cathartic to write about these experiences. And our plan is that when we're face-to-face again in however many years, we'll be doing a gallery showcase of these archives. And students did some really moving work. This semester, we were blogging, and the nice thing is that students could blog about whatever they wanted. And many of my students made cooking blogs, which is a great way to learn, how to communicate to an audience, how to organize things, etc. And so I started kind of cooking along with them. Now, as you can see, I did a terrible job making chole bhature. And that was I think the thing that students sort of appreciated is that often we see professors as these intimidating figures. And because I teach writing, I talk a lot about making mistakes and trying things, and it's okay if it doesn't work out the first time. So this was a chance of me doing something that was new to me. I made some mistakes, but it was edible. It was, I'll do better next time. But it was a chance for me to interact with my students. They were creating recipes. I would post videos of the recipes that I made or the pictures, and it was sort of a neat way to build a connection. So just to wrap it up, open pedagogy is a legacy of learning. So it's practical, it's relevant, it's renewable, it's relatable, and it's effective in terms of student knowledge retention because students are working really hands-on with the concepts. They often remember a lot more after the class is over. So I will link to some other topics. So we have a guide to making open textbooks with students, open pedagogy notebook that I mentioned. But what I really love is to hear any other questions that you have about open pedagogy or open education.
So Professor Arley, there are a couple of other questions which has come up in the meantime. So maybe I'll start with one or two, and we'll take up other questions. So in the meantime, somewhere in response to one of the queries, I've said yes, this PPT would be shared. Also, there are several other links about which Professor Arley has created compiled a Google Doc, which we will also share. Some of these links have been already shared in the PPT. So anyway, that's coming up. So one of the questions, so moving on to another question, there is a question from, how do we ensure learning outcomes when learning is done through social media? So partially it has to probably do with the rubrics, I'm just assuming, but Professor, your take on this.
Yeah, and so the goal here is that first of all, open pedagogy doesn't always have to be done for social media. So you could be having students hand in textbook chapters and Word documents and then moving them to say an open textbook or something. So we don't have to use social media, and I in fact don't use social media a ton with my students simply because I've had students who have had stalkers and stuff in the past. So, but the goal here is to think about, when I'm crafting an open pedagogy assignment, I am going to be choosing my learning outcomes that I want to assess. So for example, one of my learning outcomes is that students have to be able to tailor a message to a specific audience. So that is they can do that in a couple different ways, right? You can tailor a message to an audience in an essay, in a blog post, in a video, in a piece of social media content. So I'm making sure that I'm sort of designing my assignment to set the parameters so that students can show their learning outcomes in a variety of ways, but they're still showing the learning outcomes. So for example, with the blog that I was talking about, students, one of the learning outcomes was for students to be able to organize information using headings and bullet points. So in a recipe blog, they're doing that, they're doing that naturally. But you could also do that in a report. You could also do that in a video. You could have this presentation, for example, had headings. So it's just we're making sure that we're still assessing the learning outcomes. We're just broadening the scope of how students can show that learning.
Yeah, I think very well put, Professor. So I'll just paraphrase it. See, please understand what we are saying here is, it is not the social media per se, it is the learning objective or the assessment of the learning, or the assurance of learning, if I may use, or what do we call the learning objective that you have got, irrespective of what terms you are using. In light of that, if you can make it little interesting for the student by incorporating of the deliverance or the at least submission of the assignment via social media, that's what we are talking about. Or further than that is, one is the interest in making it interesting, other part is by making it available to other fellow students where they can give feedback to each other. That's what we are talking about. Professor, there is one more.
Exactly.
Yeah, so there is one more question very quickly I'll take on, which is kind of partially kind of loaded, in the sense the question goes like this: can we have open book examination through this pedagogy? Which I believe, if it is open pedagogy, yes, the part is there, but will it be acceptable to the university? So that part is kind of a little loaded. So maybe first your take, then I might join in.
Yeah, so one of the great things, open book examinations are considered, especially when you're teaching online, are often considered best practice simply because they're testing higher order concerns, right? So if the assignment or if the exam is designed in such a way that allows the students to engage with the material, then they either know it or they don't know, right? So when I design exams, for example, I try to imagine the ways in which students will be using these in a workplace. So I teach business communication. If I have a student who's in a meeting, they forget a term, or they forget a date, they forget some terminology, they can quickly Google that. But if they don't know how to use the concept, then that is going to be, they're not going to be successful in the workplace. So I have used exams, for example, to kind of simulate the pressure of being in a work environment. But I make it open book because in many real world situations, now that we have a cell phone in our pockets, we can often some of those memorization pieces aren't as necessary. But again, it really goes back to your university policy. So, you know, not every university has a policy that allows for open book. But my feeling is that rather than, you know, designing a closed book exam where you feel like students will not Google stuff, that takes a lot of energy, a lot of time, you know, sometimes specialized proctoring software. But designing an open book exam where you just say, okay, I assume that students have access to the internet, but you're actually going to have to use these concepts and apply them. You know, it's a lot harder to plagiarize, and often students can show they're learning better. So yeah, I definitely am a fan of open book exams, but I also recognize that different disciplines have different needs, and also different accrediting bodies have different needs. So it does depend a little bit on your context.
Yeah, so just to paraphrase again, like the previous question I did, so there is another question which has come up on this examination and university policy. I'm not reading out the question, but let me address this part. Audience, what we are looking at here is, I think Professor Arley has very clearly stated that if your university policy, let's say you have got an strict end-term policy or a mid-term policy where it has to be closed book. Of course, you can't bring in open pedagogy or let alone open book and stuff like that. But as a professor, let's say there are some quizzes, there could be some other assignment which are fully under your control, where you're trying to assess the students' learning. At least those parts you can make it. So as a open pedagogy is when we are talking about open pedagogy, what we are essentially saying is, here is a way of making the students kind of owner of their own learning. I mean, a partner rather than owner or partner. They're basically, we're co-creating knowledge. Can it be used to assess? Yes, it can be, or various other aspects of involving open pedagogy are we're basically talking about. But yet it has to be seen through the lens of your institute's policy, your university policy, your accreditation practices, and no matter how rigid they are, I'm sure even most of the schools do have some flexibility. So wherever you can, please try it out, and you'll see your students will love it. That's all I could say at the moment. Over to you, Professor.
Yeah, and I think that, you know, thanks for that summary. But yeah, and I think that that's sort of the main takeaway of this is that, you know, finding one small way to sort of partner with students, or one small way to give students some control, or one small way to give students an authentic audience, an audience outside the classroom. You know, I have found that when I started, the first thing I did was I had this report project, and I had students create the rubric for it. So they worked in groups, they identified what was important, they all proposed a rubric, and then I picked the one that I wanted to use. And that was maybe, you know, an hour-long exercise that I did in class. But it went so well that I started making other moves and other moves and other moves. And then, you know, now I teach courses that have very strong open pedagogy part. So, you know, it's sometimes doing this stuff feels a bit nerve-wracking, because it is sometimes a different approach. But finding those small ways to try it, especially when, you know, with COVID-19, a lot of how we've done things have had to change. So whether we like it or not, we've had to make some changes. So if we have to change stuff anyway, maybe now is the time to try, even as in a small way, a new approach.
I'll again make a formal request on behalf of Professor Arley. Audience, please type in your questions. I mean, there are many other questions we have addressed. Please type in any other queries that you have got. We have already hit into this open kind of a town hall. While I'm waiting for other questions, I'll just ask one of the stock question, Professor, which I had received during this, when we got the registration. So one of these questions which asks, are there any drawbacks? Of course, partially you have touched upon this idea about starting small and etc. But are there any limitation that you know of open pedagogy?
So the question is, are there any drawbacks of open pedagogy?
Yes.
Yeah. So I think that it really, again, depends on how you're using it. So for me, it's been a way to solve problems. Some of the drawbacks of the way that I do it is simply that for me, it's sometimes getting it started takes a little more time. It also seems to take a little bit more time to get students used to the idea. right? So I often have to spend a little bit more time building trust and really helping students understand why I'm doing this. So I found it overall mostly a very, very positive experience. It's definitely cut down, especially with instances of plagiarism. Really has made my teaching a lot more enjoyable, especially grading a lot more enjoyable. But yeah, in the beginning, it is one of those things where sometimes the good thing is also the bit of a double-edged sword. So the thing I like about it is that it's often a very rich learning experience. But some of the drawbacks is that sometimes a rich learning experience can be a little bit messy. You know, sometimes you don't have it can feel a little bit uncomfortable to say, I don't know exactly how, you know, students are going to react to this new approach. So it can have some messiness to it. It can, it takes often a little bit of time to get students used to the idea. But yeah, at least for me, it's been a really transformative, really positive experience.
At this stage, from my end, one more question I would believe should probably the people who have never tried, professors who have never tried, let's say, anything on open pedagogy, whether they want to try small or something significant, how would you, I mean, put yourself maybe 5 years before or whenever you got initiated into this open pedagogy as an instructor, what were the challenges that you faced from the student and how to get the buy-in from the student? If I may ask you that question.
Yeah, that's a great question. And so the way that I've gotten buy-in is talking really specifically. So first of all, when I started, I really started with thinking about what problems I had in my class. So really thinking about, you know, what is something that what problem in my class have I never been able to solve? And could open pedagogy help me with that? And so that was a way in to really think about how I could use it in my class. But every semester, yeah, I definitely have, because every semester I have a different group of students. Getting students on board, the things that I have found that have worked are, first of all, explaining why. So even bringing in some of the research and saying, here's why we're doing this. And also addressing that because this is learning out in the open, and because this is learning that is, you know, about the process. Often, it's okay if it's messy. So often students, you know, who are stressed, who are taking courses, you know, I teach a lot of students. I think 91% of my students have work at least part-time. So often students have the feeling of, I only have time to, I have to take a shortcut. So I'm so busy, I have to, you know, pick, for example, if I have to write a report, I want to pick a topic that I did last semester because I just want to go from A to B right to the right answer. And so one of the challenges is getting students to slow down and to recognize that that practice of going right to the right answer can be harmful in a workplace environment. So, you know, if you just burst to the right answer, you might miss a lot of other analysis that you should have done and expose your business to risk. So the ways that I help students are, first of all, talking about why we're doing this and what they can get out of it. So, you know, this is something you can put on your CV or your resume. This can help you get a job. I also put more of the focus when it comes to grading on the process rather than the product. So if I'm asking students to try something that's new to them, like make a video, I will often be mostly grading a reflection on that piece of video. So if someone makes a video and they've never made a video before and they're trying something new and they're in that zone where that real learning happens, where they're really working with some new concepts and ideas, their video might not work out the way that they plan. It might not be perfectly polished. So I give a certain chunk of the marks for the assignment to a reflection where they write about what were you trying to do, what went wrong, what would you do differently. And so that gives students a bit more confidence in the fact that they can try something. I can try something that's new. And if it doesn't work out, it's not going to, I'm not going to fail. And so if I really want students to take a risk, I have to think about my rubric to allow them to take those risks. So I found that when they, you know, when they see that they can take a risk and try something new and it's not going to hurt their grade, often students really get on board.
Yeah, thank you, Professor, on that you know, wonderful way of putting it across. Like if I have to you know, kind of put it in a crux, It's about, I mean, we started somewhere with this whole idea. Open pedagogy is not for the sake of open pedagogy itself. It is your learning objective. That's what you're talking about, number one. Number two is buy-in from the student, because most of the professor in many of the colleges, including mine, I'm pretty sure, we do have this, conditioning about a particular way of pedagogy. So migrating to open pedagogy, both for the teacher as well as the student, there are challenges. And that's where this processing that you talked about, if there is a rubric which clearly states it's not the output or the outcome that I'm going to evaluate, but adherence to the process, which is again going to be evaluated through a rubric. And if the students are well known, I mean, it is kind of well accepted at the beginning, that I think is going to help the students as well as a professor, if I may use a word, kind of a contract, let's say learning contract, so to say. Of course, you're not entering into a contract there. That kind of sets the agenda, and then later on, I mean, it helps you as a professor to evaluate, and to the students also it gives them a guideline how to go about. And also that's where I think we can address or leave this question on how do I get buy-in. And because I did divulge into this discussion a little bit, because there was a student question out here which said that if I'm a student, if I suddenly find myself in a course or a component of a course where open pedagogy is being adopted, then what do I do? How do I prepare? So in that context, I think this clarification, both what you said and what clarification I'm adding, please note, if you're a student or a professor, this rubric that we prepare or this guideline that you give to the student by doing this task, how is it going to help them in the longer term is what. So in a way, if you're a student, rest assured your professor is going to tell you exactly what they're looking at. Otherwise, you'll be at sea. So that's one part. And otherwise, I think as a student, you will also get opportunity to take risk, try out stuff which otherwise is not about rote learning or putting stuff in your head, rather taking an initiative and trying to do something of your own. So I think that's there. Are there any other question? So we are almost like 15 minutes past the time, and unless I see any other questions, I think maybe a last word from your end, Professor Arley.
Yeah, so thank you very much. Again, the sort of my last message would be thank you for taking the time to learn about this. That if you have any, I will put the link to my resource package that I created. But this is an approach where you might need to sit and think about it for a little while. So if you have any follow-up questions, I'll put my email in the chat, and you can feel free to send me an email. Yeah, don't be afraid to just, even if you have a very restrictive syllabus or, a really, don't be afraid to start with just something small, or even just ask students, I often will ask students, like, what assignment would you love to do in this class? Like, what's something that you would love to do in this class, or you would love to learn more about? And go with that interest. Sometimes I'm really surprised. So sometimes, the thing that interests me about the class is not the thing that interests the students about the class. So, I think the cool thing about this particular approach is that it looks different every single time I do it. Every single time I get some sort of wonderful surprise from students. Every time I find that a student has a skill I had absolutely no idea that they had, or every time I get a chance to have a conversation I never would have had. So yeah, it can be a messy way of learning, but for me, it's been a really kind of career-changing way of teaching. So thank you again for having me. I'm just so thrilled to be able to talk with you guys today.
Yeah, so thank you, Professor Arley, for taking time out and kind of explaining to us some of the kind of a basics about open pedagogy. And what I've done is in the chat box, I've shared a link. But please note, post this session, maybe by tomorrow sometime, I'll share a link to the video as well as these, these links that I'm sharing, also the PPT. So all these things will be made available to all of you through your mailbox. With that, let me again very formally thank all the participants for taking their time out on a Sunday, sorry, in a weekday. And for India's time, it is like almost it is hitting close to 9 now. And some of our Malaysian and Indonesian participant, probably it is in the mid of night. So thanks for taking this time out and engaging with this material. They who have been getting some connection error, or some of you who might not have been able to join in time, we will be sharing the video link. And with that, we can always use the chat box to thank Professor Arley for her wonderful illustration about open pedagogy. And so thank you all of you, and thank you Professor Arley for taking time, and maybe in future we'll get another opportunity to hear from you again. And with this, I think let me say goodbye to all of you.